They stood silent, trembling when the auctioneer called their names. 3 sisters, no kin left, no future. But the man who stepped forward didn't want workers or servants. Widower Elia's brand came seeking something else: redemption. The bidding started low, as if they weren't girls but crates of rusted tools or sacks of spoiling grain. The square was quieter than usual, but the silence wasn't kindness. It was hunger, greed. Not many words passed between the townsfolk as they circled, boots crunching against frostbitten dirt, hands folded tight beneath their coats. Sheriff Dole stood near the gallows, arms crossed, keeping the law just enough to say he did. And up on the platform, flanked by 2 deputies and a sheet of crumpled paper with names scrawled like property tags, the sisters stood. Annabeth, the oldest at 15, stared at no one, lips tight, jaw set like she could hold the other 2 up by sheer will. Clara was 13, thin as a fence rail, her eyes jumping from face to face like a rabbit in open field. And Miriam, only 9, clutched Clara's hand with such force her knuckles went white. They wore matching calico dresses, hand-me-downs from the charity barrel, and the same braided ribbon in their hair, as if dressing alike would make them harder to separate. It wouldn't. No one had told them that, or maybe someone had, and they just refused to listen. "First girl Annabeth Green," barked the auctioneer, voice gruff from whiskey and wind. "Strong, steady, good with livestock, startin' at $4. The crowd stirred, a few murmured. A man near the front tilted his hat and scratched his chin. Another spit tobacco into the dirt. Bidding began like the lighting of a slow fire, low flames licking under a wet log. $4 became 5, 5 to 6. 6 held for a long moment. Then, "7," called a voice from the back. Heads turned. He hadn't been standing there before, or maybe no one had noticed him arrive. The man was tall, shoulders set beneath a thick gray coat, hat pulled low, a black scarf wrapped tight around the lower half of his face. He didn't move as he spoke, didn't raise a hand, just stood with the wind to his back and eyes locked not on the girl, but on the platform as a whole. The auctioneer squinted. "You bid 7. A small nod. "Name?" "Elia's Brand." Whispers rippled like wind through dry grass. Brand. That name wasn't unknown. 2 winters ago he'd buried his wife and infant son after fever took them both within a week. Since then he'd spoken little, kept to his stretch of land east of the ridge, and let the world forget he existed. He had no need for house help, no reason to hire, no neighbors to impress. And yet here he was, offering $7 for a girl no one wanted. The auctioneer shrugged. 7 it is, sold. Annabeth flinched. She turned her head, her jaw trembling now, but she didn't speak. Clara and Miriam began to cry, soft, near-silent weeping that made the still air ache. The deputies moved forward to separate them. "Wait," said Brand. The word struck like a hammer. "Next girl," the auctioneer began. "I'm not done," Brand said, stepping forward now. His boots made no sound on the cold-packed dirt, and he moved like a man with no rush and no fear. He faced the auctioneer directly. "I'll take all 3. The man blinked. "You bid on 1. "I bid 7 for Annabeth. I'll pay the same for each." "You got $21 on you." Brand reached into his coat, pulled free a weathered pouch, and tossed it at the man's feet. The jangle was unmistakable coin, heavy and real. "Count it." Murmurs turned to full-on noise now. Dole stepped forward from his post. "You can't just buy." "I followed the rules." Brand didn't raise his voice, didn't have to. "They're up for auction, I bid." "But what do you want them for?" Dole asked, suspicion dripping from his words like molasses. Elias looked at the girls. This time, finally, his eyes met theirs. "Not what you think." He held that gaze, steady and unflinching, until Dole looked away. The transaction took less than 10 minutes. Elias signed the paper, his name rough but clear, and collected the girls without ceremony. No one clapped, no one smiled. Most just turned away, disappointed there'd be no smaller pieces to pick from. The sisters followed him like shadows, Annabeth holding Clara's hand, Clara holding Miriam's. When he led them toward his horse and wagon, not a single one resisted. Not a single one asked where they were going. It was escape, and escape for now was enough. The road east was thin and winding, cut between frost-choked trees and narrow streams. Elias didn't speak for the first 2 miles. The girls sat huddled in the back, wrapped in a single wool blanket he'd tossed to them, still too stunned to ask why. Finally, Clara leaned forward. "Are we gonna be servants?" she asked, voice barely louder than wind. "No," Elias said. "Are we going to a farm?" "Yes." "To work? To live?" Annabeth narrowed her eyes. "You're not going to separate us?" "No." She stared hard, waiting. "You don't know us. Why would you take all 3? Elias glanced at her through the rear view. "Because someone should have." They rode the rest of the way in silence. His cabin sat just over the eastern ridge, tucked between a stand of evergreens and the curve of a creek. It was small, 2 rooms, low roof, chimney already smoking, but clean. Smoke curled upward from the flue, and the porch had been recently swept. Not a mansion, not much more than a shell, but better than where they'd been. He didn't offer a tour, just unlocked the door, held it open, and said, "You'll sleep inside. Stove's already warm." Inside, the girls stood in the center of the room, unmoving. Annabeth's hands were clenched, still half expecting a trick. Miriam clung to her ribbon. Clara sniffled once, then held it in. Elias poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove, then started chopping roots into a pot like they'd all done this before. "I only got 1 bed," he said, "but I'll sleep on the floor, you 3 take it." "You're not going to lock the door?" Annabeth asked. "I will from the inside." Something shifted in the air. Not trust, not yet, but confusion, wary disbelief. The kind that makes hope feel like a trap. Still, when the stew began to boil and the smell of carrots and onion filled the room, none of them resisted. They ate slowly, watching him the whole time. When night fell, Elias set a blanket by the fire and laid down without a word. The girls climbed into the bed together, a tangle of limbs and nervous breath. Clara whispered, "Do you think we're safe?" Annabeth stared at the ceiling, then over at Elias. "I don't know." Miriam tucked her ribbon beneath the pillow, like she used to when Mama was alive. She didn't speak, but she didn't cry either. And in the quiet, with the fire crackling low, no one saw Elias blink back the thing in his eyes that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief. Just something close to beginning again. But beginnings never last long. Because come morning, there'd be boots in the snow, a man with a badge, and a question Elias wasn't ready to answer. The knock came before dawn, soft but deliberate, not the kind made by accident, or wind, or someone unsure. Elias opened his eyes before the second knock fell. The fire had died to coals. He rose slowly, careful not to wake the girls curled together on the bed, and crossed the room in 3 steps. He lifted the latch and cracked the door just wide enough to see who was waiting. Sheriff Dole stood there, coat dusted in snow, hat low over his eyes, gloved hands clasped tight behind his back. The man didn't smile. "Didn't figure you'd be up." Elias kept the door at an inch. "Didn't figure you'd come this early." "Mind if I step in?" "I do." The sheriff exhaled through his nose and glanced past Elias into the room, where the shape of the girls could be seen faintly in the low light. "Just came to ask a few questions." "You asked your questions yesterday." "Not the ones I need to ask now." Dole didn't push forward, but his tone sharpened. "Those girls, you know what folks are saying." "Don't care. They think it's strange, you buying all 3, bringing them out here after everything." Elias said nothing. Dole leaned forward slightly. "You trying to build a new family brand, replace the one you lost?" The jab landed, but Elias didn't flinch. "That's not your business." "Maybe not," the sheriff straightened, "but it is mine if someone makes a mistake that puts those girls in harm's way." Elias opened the door wider now, just enough for Dole to see his face in full. "If I were you, Sheriff, I'd be more worried about who let them get to the auction block in the first place." A silence stretched between them, thick and bitter. Then Dole adjusted his gloves and stepped back. "Just keep your nose clean." Elias shut the door without another word. By the time the sun rose, the girls were stirring. Miriam woke first, clutching her ribbon like it was a lifeline. Clara blinked blearily and whispered a groggy morning. Annabeth sat up last, eyes immediately scanning the room for signs of change. She caught Elias' expression the moment he turned from the stove. "Who was at the door?" "Sheriff." Annabeth's back straightened. "Is he coming back?" "Maybe." "What for?" Questions. Elias ladled out bowls of warm porridge, setting them gently on the table. "Don't matter, you're not going anywhere." The girls sat and ate in silence, the kind thick with thoughts too big for words. Annabeth watched him the whole time. Clara picked at her food like it might vanish if she blinked. Miriam finished hers and licked the spoon with quiet reverence. When Elias finally sat, his own bowl untouched, he looked at each of them. "You have people." Annabeth shook her head. "Mama died last spring, fever. Papa disappeared 2 winters before that. Some say he ran off. Some say he froze out near Calico Ridge." She swallowed. "Aunt was supposed to take us. She sold the house and left instead." Clara added, "We stayed in the barn for a while. Folks brought food sometimes. But when the land got bought up, we got turned out." "Then the sheriff came," Annabeth said flatly. "Said the town take care of us." Elias let the words settle before he nodded. "I won't let that happen again." Later that morning, he hitched the wagon and drove into town. Alone. He didn't tell the girls where he was going, but he left the rifle out of the cabinet and enough food stacked near the stove to last until nightfall. Annabeth locked the door behind him, watching from the window until the wagon disappeared behind the trees. He rode straight to the general store, and when the bell above the door chimed, every head inside turned. Tom Prather, the owner, glanced up from his ledger and offered a tentative nod. "Brand." "Need supplies," Elias said, walking straight to the counter. "Blankets, coats, boots for 3 girls, young, also food, enough for a month." Prather hesitated. "Heard you took the green girls." "You heard right." "You planning to keep 'em?" Elias stared at him until the man looked away. "Ring it up." Prather scribbled notes on the paper and began pulling goods from the shelves. He paused over a rack of scarves, fingers twitching. "They're not like animals, you know. You can't just shelter 'em and expect it to be enough." "I'm not sheltering them." Prather blinked. "You're not." "I'm raising them." The store went silent. Back at the cabin, the day passed in slow waves. Annabeth paced. Clara read an old book she found on the shelf. Miriam drew on scraps of paper using a stub of coal from the stove. The wind whispered through the trees but didn't press. It was a rare moment of peace, and they didn't trust it. Evening brought Elias home, the wagon full, the horses weary. He didn't say much as he hauled crates and bags inside, but when the girls saw the coats and boots and the threadbare but warm quilts, they stood in quiet astonishment. Miriam touched hers like it was made of gold. "You didn't have to," Clara whispered. "I know," Elias replied. He cooked again. This time they helped. Clara peeled potatoes, Miriam stirred the stew, and Annabeth watched the door. Her guard never fully dropped. Elias noticed, and after the girls had eaten and gone to bed, he pulled an old notebook from the shelf, sat by the fire, and began to write. He wrote of the first time he held his son. He wrote of his wife's cough in the final days. He wrote of the grave he dug by hand, 2 mounds side by side. He wrote of silence so thick it felt like drowning. And then he wrote the date, underlined it twice, and beneath it, "Today the house felt full again." Days passed, slowly then all at once. The girls adjusted in ways only children do, half suspicious, half hoping. Miriam began humming again when she swept. Clara asked to help with the chickens. Annabeth still watched the woods like an ambush was always near, but her jaw wasn't so tight and her shoulders didn't always stay square. They learned to cook from Elias, learned how to split wood, how to check traps. They weren't servants, they weren't possessions, they were something else, something approaching family. But the quiet couldn't last. One afternoon, when the snow had melted to slush and birds dared return to the trees, Elias found a note nailed to his fence. No signature, just 4 words. "You don't deserve them." He burned the note in the stove and didn't speak of it. But that night, he slept with the rifle across his knees. The next morning brought more than birdsong. A man on horseback arrived, neatly dressed, city-polished and smiling like he already owned the place. He introduced himself as Walter Bryn, a legal representative from the capital, claiming to be handling the Green estate. Said he'd come to check on the welfare of the girls. Elias didn't invite him in. Bryn smiled tighter. "You don't strike me as the proper guardian type, Mr. Brand." Elias didn't blink. "They're not up for discussion." "Well, see, that's where you're wrong. According to territorial law, guardianship must be approved and overseen by a representative of the state, which is me." Elias said nothing. "I could take them today," Bryn added smoothly. "File the papers in the morning." "You do that," Elias said quietly, "and you'll wish you de-knocked." Bryn paled just a touch, tipped his hat and rode off, but not far. He camped just beyond the ridge, close enough to watch. Elias saw the smoke from his fire that night. So did Annabeth. "They're not going to stop," she said. Elias nodded. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. "Why buy us? Why risk this?" He didn't answer right away, just looked toward the fire. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind." She watched him a moment, then turned toward the bed. "So do we." And while they slept, Elias sat awake, one hand on the rifle, the other clutching the journal he'd started not for himself, but for the day he'd have to explain why he chose 3 strangers when everyone else looked away. Because the truth was, he didn't save them. They were saving him. But the men in town weren't finished. And soon, someone would come, not to ask, not to threaten, but to take. Elias didn't sleep the night Walter Bryn returned. He didn't even lie down. He sat in the chair near the fire with the rifle across his lap and listened to every creak of the wind against the cabin, every shift of the trees beyond the windows, every soft breath from the bed where the girls slept tangled beneath wool and hope. He kept the lamp low and his back to the wall. When the sun finally rose, gray and cautious, it found him still there, watching. Outside, the woods lay silent. Bryn's campfire had burned out sometime before dawn. The smoke trail was gone, the ash cold. But the danger was. Elias knew that. He rose stiffly, moved to the stove, and stirred the embers until flame caught again. He set water to boil and didn't look toward the door, even when footsteps broke the still morning quiet. Annabeth came first, hair mussed, eyes already sharp. She'd seen something in his face the night before, something that hadn't left her. "You stayed up," she said. He didn't deny it, didn't feel like sleeping. Clara came next, still rubbing her eyes, and Miriam stumbled in last, carrying her ribbon in one hand and dragging a quilt with the other. None of them spoke as they ate. The air was heavy with unasked questions. "Is the man still out there?" Clara asked finally. "Not close," Elias said, "but he'll be back." "Why does he want us?" Miriam asked, voice small. Elias poured another cup of coffee and answered slowly. "Some men don't like being told no." Annabeth stared down at her plate. "We can leave." "No," Elias said flatly. "But you're not running again, not unless I tell you." The force in his voice shut the room quiet. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, something harder. A warning meant not for them, but for the road ahead. By midday, Elias had saddled the wagon again. "Going to town," he told them. "Won't be long, lock the door behind me." Annabeth frowned. "What for?" "Paperwork." Clara blinked. Paperwork. He didn't explain. The ride into town felt different than before. The weight of eyes on him was heavier, the silence in the streets more deliberate. People paused mid-task when he passed. Shopkeepers stood too still behind their windows. Even the blacksmith stopped hammering when Elias rode past. No one spoke, but they were watching. He went first to the post office, asked for forms, then to the small, dusty office where the county clerk worked, a hunched man with watery eyes and a penchant for lost ledgers. Need to register dependents, Elias said without preamble. The clerk squinted at him. What for? I'm their guardian now. They got kin. No. Don't need a formal claim if they're just help. They're not help, Elias snapped. They're family. The word landed like a stone in still water. The clerk adjusted his glasses and handed over the forms. You'll need a witness, someone respectable. Elias exhaled slow. Who counts as respectable these days? Sheriff, preacher, teacher, maybe Prather. Sheriff won't help, preacher's dead, teacher moved east. Then I guess that leaves Prather. Elias nodded once and left. He found Prather sweeping dust off his porch and said, Need you to sign something. Prather looked him over. About the girls. Yeah. The storekeeper hesitated. They happy. They're safe. Not the same thing. Elias didn't argue. He just handed over the paper. Prather read it slow, then signed with a sigh. If this goes south, Brand, I had nothing to do with it. I'd never let it touch you. Back at the cabin, the girls were waiting by the window. Miriam saw him first and ran to the door. Clara unlocked it. Annabeth watched the woods behind him, always expecting trouble. Did it work? She asked. He handed her a copy of the form, stamped and signed. As of now, it's official. Clara smiled. Miriam cheered and danced around the room. Annabeth didn't move. What about Bryn? He'll come again, but now we have something to hold up. Will that stop him? No, Elias admitted, but it makes things harder. That night they ate stew and dried apples and sat by the fire playing a card game Elias hadn't touched in years. He taught them slowly, letting them learn the rhythm. Clara cheated, Miriam giggled, and Annabeth watched everything too carefully, as if any moment might be their last. And maybe it was. Because the next morning brought not Bryn, but something worse. It started with the sound of hooves again, but more of them. Not one horse, but three, then voices, loud, confident, not asking to be invited. Elias rose from where he'd been whittling near the hearth and moved to the door. He didn't open it, he just listened. You sure this is the place? A voice asked, deep, southern drawl, unbothered. That's what the lawyer said, came another. Widower, lives alone, took 3 girls home from auction like they was kittens. Then a laugh, cruel. Bet he's got 'em lined up nice and pretty now. Elias opened the door. 3 men sat on horseback, their faces smug, their posture relaxed. They looked like hired hands, but their eyes said otherwise. The lead rider tipped his hat. Afternoon. State your business, Elias said. The man didn't answer right away, just dismounted slowly, theatrically. Name's Bryce. These here are Lee and Carter. We're under contract. Who's? Bryce grinned. Let's just say Mr. Bryn's got interests in making sure the law's followed. There's no law being broken. Not yet, Bryce said, but that depends on what we find inside. You're not stepping in that door. Bryce nodded as if amused. And what if I do? Elias didn't answer with words, just raised the rifle. Bryce's smile vanished. Lee and Carter stiffened behind him but didn't draw. We're just here to talk, Bryce said. Talk is done. Look, Mr. Brand, he continued slower now, I get it. Lonely man, lost his kin, finds a few stray girls and thinks maybe, just maybe, he can build something back. But you and I both know that's not how this works. You don't know a damn thing about me. Oh, but I do. You're the man who walks into town once a month and leaves twice as fast. You're the man who didn't scream when his wife died. You're the man who bought 3 girls with silence and silver and thought no one would ask why. Elias stepped off the porch. You're going to leave now. Bryce studied him, then nodded. All right, we'll leave, but this ain't over. Then bring more than words next time. Bryce mounted up. Oh, we will. They rode off slow, loud on purpose, making sure every hoofprint was deep and clear. Elias watched them until they vanished beyond the tree line. That night there was no game, no stew, no music, just silence, and the knowledge that something was coming. Annabeth came to him while the others slept. She sat on the edge of the hearth and looked into the dying fire. I've seen men like them before, she said. When Papa left, one came around the barn, said he'd help us, brought food, asked questions, then he asked more. Elias didn't speak. He touched Clara's hand, said it was just kindness. Mama threw him out with a rake. That night someone poisoned our well. Elias turned toward her. You think they'll come back with worse? She nodded. I know they will. Then we'll be ready. Annabeth studied him for a long moment, then whispered, Why do you care what happens to us? He considered the question carefully. Because when my wife was dying, I prayed for someone to come, he said. Anyone, and no one did. She looked down. So you're saving us to make up for it? No, Elias said. I'm saving you because no one else will. She didn't cry, she didn't thank him. She just nodded and stood. But when she turned to leave, she paused. Don't wait until it's too late, she said. Next time, shoot first. And then she was gone, back to bed, leaving Elias alone with the fire and the sound of distant wind carrying something dark toward them. Something not yet arrived, but coming fast. Morning broke uneasy, the kind of morning where the light itself seemed unsure, filtering slow and brittle through gray cloud cover that never quite gave way. Elias stepped out onto the porch long before the girls stirred, boots crunching soft frost, rifle in hand. He scanned the woods for any sign of movement, fresh tracks, broken branches, a flash of coat. But the trees stood motionless, branches like frozen fingers stretched toward a sky that offered nothing. There was no smoke from Bryn's camp. No sign of Bryce or the others, just quiet, and Elias knew better than to trust it. He went about the chores with the same precision he always had, watered the horses, checked the traps, hauled in wood, but every sound behind him twisted his gut tight. He found himself turning too fast, watching too long. He knew what was coming, he just didn't know when. By the time the girls emerged, bundled against the cold, he was already stacking the 3rd row of firewood beside the cabin wall. Clara skipped over, cheeks pink and bright despite the tension that hung low and thick. Can I help? She asked, already reaching for a log. Elias nodded. Stack them tight, keeps the air out. Dry wood burns better. She mimicked his rhythm, determined. Miriam followed soon after, dragging her ribbon behind her like a tail. Annabeth came last, arms crossed, eyes still wary from the night before. They're not going to let this go, she said quietly, just for him. I know. So what's the plan? Elias hesitated, then, we stay ready, we stay smart, and we don't run. Annabeth didn't argue, but she didn't nod either. She just watched the tree line like she was willing it to give up its secrets. The day passed slow, like it was biding time. Elias went into town again, not for supplies but for words. He found Sheriff Dole at his desk, sipping burnt coffee and pretending he hadn't been waiting. You've seen them, Elias said, closing the door behind him. Dole didn't look up. Seen who? Bryn, the men. The sheriff sighed, loud and tired. They haven't broken any laws, Brand. Yet. That's the thing, ain't it? Dole finally met his eyes. They know how to stay just behind the line, close enough to breathe on it but never enough to step over. So you'll do nothing. I'm a lawman, not a ghost chaser. Elias leaned in. What happens when they stop playing quiet? Dole hesitated. Then, if they do, you send word fast. That won't help if they come fast. Then you make sure they don't. Back at the cabin, Elias found the girls where he'd left them, safe, warm, still alert. He hid the disappointment in his face as he stepped inside. He didn't want them knowing how thin the rope had become. That night after dinner, he brought out something he hadn't touched in years, an old, weathered book of stories, fables mostly, simple tales with rough morals. He cracked it open and read aloud as the girls huddled around the fire, voices quiet, shoulders touching. Clara leaned against his knee without noticing. Miriam fell asleep before the end of the first story. Annabeth never once took her eyes off the door. 3 days passed. The threats didn't come back. No more men on horseback. No more notes. Even the woods seemed to relax. And that made Elias worry more than anything. Because when danger stops knocking, it means it's found another way in. The warning came from Prather, not a man known for speaking much beyond prices. Elias was in the store picking up salt and lard when the old man leaned in across the counter and said, without looking up, "Bryn S. in the saloon." Elias stiffened. Now. Came in this morning, not alone. Elias left the supplies and walked the 3 blocks to the saloon without stopping. He pushed the batwing doors open and found Bryn seated near the back, boots up on a second chair, sipping from a glass too clean for this town. He wasn't alone. Bryce was beside him, and the other 2 men, Lee and Carter, flanked the table like dogs waiting for a signal. Elias walked straight toward them. Bryn didn't look surprised. "Ah, Mr. Brand. You didn't waste much time." Bryn sipped. "We gave you days. That's a lifetime in this territory. You're not welcome here." "I don't need to be. The law doesn't require comfort, it requires clarity." Elias stared him down. "Those girls are mine. They're not property. They're family. Not by blood." Elias' jaw tightened. "Blood doesn't define family, choice does." Bryn's expression never changed. "You made a choice, so did we." Bryce leaned forward. "They belong with their own kind." Elias' hand brushed his coat, where the grip of the revolver sat nestled. "You want to say that again?" Bryn raised a hand, placating. "No need for dramatics. We're not here to start anything, just to see things set right." "They are right." Bryn folded a piece of paper and slid it across the table. "Petition for removal of custody, signed by 3 local witnesses." Elias didn't touch it. "You file that with the county, the girls become wards of the state again," Bryn said. "We both know what happens then." Elias looked at the signatures. All names he recognized. One was the schoolteacher who'd left town months ago. Another was the butcher's apprentice. The third was Sheriff Dole. He took the paper and left without a word. That night he didn't light the lamp. He didn't read from the book. He didn't speak much at all. Clara noticed first, "What's wrong?" Elias didn't answer. Annabeth stepped closer. "What did they do?" He looked at her then, face lined with something not quite fear but close. "They're trying to take you back." Miriam froze. "Back?" "No one's going anywhere," he said quickly, but the words felt hollow. Clara clung to his side. Annabeth stepped away. "What can we do?" Elias' voice dropped to a whisper. "We prepare, and we wait." They didn't sleep much. The wind outside had a voice again. Not the scream of a storm, but the slow drag of something breathing deep and slow, just beyond the trees. 2 days passed, and then the knock came. Not a scrape, not timid, 3 sharp, deliberate raps. Annabeth was already standing. Clara clutched Miriam to her chest. Elias rose, rifle in hand, and moved to the door. He opened it slow. Sheriff Dole stood there, hat in hand, rain dripping from his coat. "You signed it," Elias said. "I had no choice." You always have a choice. Dole didn't answer. What do they want? They're coming tonight. Elia's grip tightened. With what? A court order, 3 witnesses. They'll call it legal. And what if I say no? Dole met his eyes. Then it becomes something else. The door closed hard in the sheriff's face. Elias turned back to the girls. Pack what you can, quick. Clara blinked. We're leaving. No, Elias said. We're hiding. He led them through the back door and into the trees, past the first ridge and into the shallow cave he'd found years ago, back when the grief still walked beside him like a shadow. He'd cleared it since then. Stored blankets, kindling, even dried meat. If I don't come back by morning, he said, you stay put. Annabeth grabbed his sleeve. No. I have to buy time. We can help. Not this time. She didn't let go. You can't fight all of them. I'm not fighting, he said softly. I'm reminding them who I am. He left before she could answer. Back at the cabin, the lanterns were all lit, the fire stoked high. The rifle hung ready near the door. Elias didn't pace, didn't drink, he just sat. Waiting. They came as promised. Bryn in front, coat pressed and polished. Bryce beside him, gun visible, the others close behind. Dole followed last, eyes full of shame. This is your last chance, Bryn said. Elias rose slow. You can't win, Bryn added. The law's not on your side. Elias stepped forward, then let the law try and take them. Bryce drew first. But Elias moved faster. And the night shattered. Bryce's revolver never cleared the holster. Elias didn't raise his rifle either, not yet. But the threat was real, thick in the cold air, coiled like a rattler ready to strike. What stopped the blood wasn't hesitation. It was Elias stepping forward, not with violence but with something colder. Silence. Measured. Final. He stared down Bryce like a man who'd stared down worse things in the mirror. You want a gunfight, Elias said, voice low. You better be ready to lose it. Bryce's hand twitched, but Bryn caught his arm. No, Bryn said, his voice calm but sharp enough to draw blood. Not here. Bryce looked to the others for permission, but Carter had already taken a step back. Lee wasn't even watching anymore. His eyes had drifted toward the tree line behind the cabin. Elias noticed. Something you hearin' back there? He asked. Lee blinked, thought I saw something. Elias didn't flinch. He knew what it was. Annabeth. She was watching. From the trees, silent, sharp-eyed, tracking every twitch of every gun hand like a hawk circling snakes. Bryn reached into his coat, not for a weapon, for a folded paper, thick with legal weight. Court order, he said, signed in St. Arbor, recognized by the state. Elias didn't take it. You've no legal claim to those girls, Bryn continued. Your word don't hold against ink, and this one, he gestured toward Sheriff Dole, will see it carried through. Dole looked like a man halfway drowned. Elias. You going to force this, Tom? Elias asked. I'm asking you to stand down, please. Elias stepped aside. Then come in, he said, but you won't find what you're looking for. Cautious now, Bryn nodded at the men. They moved slow, like the air had grown heavier around them. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled bright, casting long shadows across the floor. The girls were gone, their blankets missing. The stove warm but not fresh. The cups washed. The place looked like it had been undisturbed for days. Where are they? Bryn demanded. Elias didn't answer, just stared. Dole moved past him, searched the kitchen, the bedroom, the loft, came back empty-handed. They're not here. They were, Bryn snarled. Elias finally looked at him. Then you should have come sooner. You think you can outlast the law. I think the law forgot what it was meant to protect. Bryn stepped closer, too close, close enough that the scent of pipe smoke and cold metal wrapped around his words. This won't end here. I know, Elias said, but it won't end with you winning either. They left not in victory, but in retreat, Bryn fuming, Bryce glaring, Dole lingering like a man who might yet switch sides if only he found the spine to do it. Elias watched them go from the porch, waited until the last hoofbeat faded, then turned and vanished into the trees. He found the girls still huddled in the cave. Clara had cried herself hoarse. Miriam had fallen asleep curled against Annabeth's side. Annabeth stood guard at the mouth of the cave, knife in hand, face unreadable. "They gone?" she asked. "For now." "We have to leave," she said quietly. "They'll just come back stronger." Elias crouched beside her. "You scared?" "No," she said, then after a breath, "Yes." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I've been scared too, most of my life." She looked up at him for the first time like she was seeing him different. "I lost my boy," Elias said. "He wasn't much older than Miriam when he got sick. My wife tried to save him. We both did. I prayed. I traded every bit of land I could for medicine that came too late. He died in my arms." Annabeth said nothing. "She followed a month later," Elias added. "Stopped eating, stopped talking, she just disappeared right in front of me." "I'm sorry," Annabeth whispered. "I thought the silence would be easier than the grief. I was wrong." Miriam stirred, whimpering in her sleep. Elias picked her up, holding her like she weighed nothing. "We're not hiding anymore," he said. Annabeth nodded. They walked back together, through brush and shadow and wind that tried its best to push them down. But it couldn't, not anymore. The next day, Elias made a decision he'd been avoiding since the first knock on his door. He hitched the wagon, packed a bag, and saddled the horse. "We're going to St. Arbor," he said. Clara's eyes widened. "That's far." "It's where the signatures came from," Elias told her, "and it's where we clear your names." They traveled light and fast, through hills scarred with wind and low valleys where snow still clung like stubborn ghosts. At night, they slept in the wagon. Elias kept watch. At dawn, they rode again. It took 3 days. St. Arbor was bigger than Cold Hollow. Brick buildings, train tracks, men in suits who didn't carry rifles across their backs. But the fear here was quieter, more polished. It walked behind closed doors and whispered through keyholes. Elias went straight to the courthouse. The clerk looked up. "You have an appointment." "I need to contest a custody order." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "On whose behalf?" Elias motioned behind him. The girls stood in a row, dirty, tired, small. "They're mine," he said, "by choice, not blood." The next few hours blurred. A judge listened. Another clerk questioned. Elias signed 3 forms, submitted the original registration Prather had witnessed, and answered every question with the kind of calm that made people stop and listen. Clara whispered once, "Are we gonna lose again?" "No," Elias said. Because he wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to be heard. Finally, they were told to wait. They sat on the courthouse steps, boots dusty, stomachs empty, but shoulders unbowed. Annabeth never stopped watching the doors. When they finally opened, it was the judge himself who stepped out. He looked tired. "You made your case," he said, "and it's compelling." Elias waited. "I've voided the Bryn petition. As of now, legal guardianship remains in your hands." Clara gasped. Miriam hugged Annabeth so hard she squeaked. The judge held up a hand. "But be warned, Bryn's reach runs deep. This might hold him off legally, but men like him don't always play by the letter." "I'm not afraid of him," Elias said. "Good," the judge replied, "because he'll be furious." They stayed the night at a boarding house, small and tight, but safe. Elias let the girls have the bed. He sat in a chair by the door, eyes on the hallway. But he didn't sleep. He remembered too well what rage looked like when it came with a smile. They returned to Cold Hollow 2 days later. The cabin stood untouched. But there were signs, footprints too fresh near the fence. A shovel moved from where it should have been, the woodpile shifted. They'd been watched. They were still being watched. That night, Elias spoke, while the girls sat close around the fire. "You know what's coming." Annabeth nodded. "He won't give up." "No," Elias said, "but neither will we." Outside, the wind picked up again. This time, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a beginning. Because Bryn was out there, somewhere between the trees, between the law and the shadows, and he was coming not for justice, but for vengeance. And Elias Brand would be ready. It started with silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the hush that comes before dawn or after snowfall. This was different, heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. Elias stood by the window, eyes trained on the dark woods beyond the fence, body still but mind sharp. He knew that kind of silence. It meant men were moving. It meant someone was planning something terrible and trying to do it without leaving a sound. Annabeth noticed it too. She didn't speak as she loaded the kindling into the stove or as she quietly refilled the water bucket from the pump. Her eyes stayed on the tree line. Miriam clung to her side now, silent as a mouse, while Clara shadowed Elias, always within arm's reach, pretending not to understand what the quiet meant. But she did. They all did. By midday, Elias had gone through every corner of the cabin twice, checked the rifle, checked the revolver, double-checked the traps around the perimeter. He didn't know how many would come or when, but he knew they would. Bryn didn't like to lose, and he just lost in front of a court that carried more weight than his slick tongue or his threats ever could. That kind of man didn't walk away. He waited, and when the right night came, he struck. Elias had once been like that too, not in cruelty, but in patience, in certainty. The way he waited through his son's illness, the way he watched the woman he loved fade inch by inch until nothing was left but silence and skin. That was a different kind of waiting, one that teaches you what's worth saving and what's worth fighting for. The girls were worth both. That night he didn't sleep. Neither did Annabeth. They sat by the fire, its glow flickering across their faces, casting tall shadows on the log walls. Clara curled up near the stove, thumb in her mouth, though she'd sworn she was too old for that now. Miriam had fallen asleep on a pile of quilts, her breathing soft, even. Elias sharpened his knife slowly, methodically, more for the sound than the blade. "They're coming tonight," Annabeth said, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "You think we'll make it?" she asked. He looked over at her. This girl who'd stood at an auction block with her chin raised and a tear on her cheek, who'd held her sisters when the nights were too cold and the memories too loud. This girl who had learned to fight without swinging her fists. "I think," he said slowly, "that if we don't, they'll still know we didn't go easy." She nodded, then stood and disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, she held the carving knife. Her hands trembled a little, but she held it right, tight, proper. "Stay close to your sisters," Elias said, "no matter what." She nodded again. "I will." The knock came just after midnight. Not soft, not uncertain, a hard thud, 3 strikes. Elias didn't flinch. He stepped to the door and opened it. Bryn stood there. Behind him, Bryce, Carter, Lee, 3 more men Elias didn't recognize, all of them armed, all of them with the kind of stance that told you they weren't looking to talk. "You're not welcome," Elias said, voice flat. Bryn smiled. It wasn't a smile meant for pleasantries. It was the smile of a man who had already decided how the night would end. "You can't hide behind paper forever," he said. "The law only protects you while it's watching." "Then I guess we're lucky. I don't rely on the law," Elias replied. Bryn stepped forward, boots crunching frost. "You give them to us right now and we walk away. No fire, no blood, just what's right." "They're not yours." "They're not yours either." "I chose them," Elias said. "That makes them mine." Bryce's hand hovered near his gun. Carter's eyes flicked toward the windows, calculating. "We've got you outnumbered," Bryn said. "You've got numbers," Elias admitted, "but I've got something else." Bryn raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "A reason." Then he stepped back and slammed the door. The first bullet hit the wall just left of the window, sending a spray of splinters into the room. Clara screamed. Annabeth dove over Miriam. Elias rolled toward the rifle, ducking low. He fired once, heard someone outside curse and retreat behind the barn. The girls scrambled behind the heavy table Elias had upended days ago for this exact reason. A makeshift barricade. He'd reinforced the walls too, patched the weak spots. This cabin wasn't just shelter now, it was a line in the sand. The next few minutes blurred. Gunshots cracked like thunder. Windows shattered. Elias moved like muscle memory, loading, ducking, firing. Not aiming to kill, just to slow them, dissuade. He knew a man could bleed out just from a graze if he was scared enough. Bryce made it to the porch, kicked the door once, twice. Elias let him get the third kick in, then shot through the wood. The scream that followed told him Bryce wouldn't be kicking anything for a while. Annabeth stayed low, keeping the younger girls down. Clara sobbed silently into her sleeve. Miriam clutched a stuffed rabbit she hadn't touched in weeks. Outside, Bryn was shouting orders, but his voice had lost its smooth edge. He hadn't expected this much resistance. He hadn't expected Elias to fight like a man who had nothing left to lose. Because Elias didn't, not anymore. Except them. And maybe that was more than he'd ever had. Then something shifted. The gunfire stopped. Silence again. Elias didn't move from his spot near the hearth. He could hear footsteps crunching around the perimeter. 1, 2, 3. Then, fire. It started at the back wall. Someone had soaked the logs in lamp oil. The flames licked up fast, orange and hungry. Smoke bled into the room before they could even react. Clara screamed again. Miriam started coughing. Elias grabbed the rifle, slung it across his back, and turned to the girls. "Out, now, back door." Annabeth didn't argue. She hoisted Miriam onto her back, grabbed Clara's hand, and bolted toward the back hallway. Elias kicked open the rear exit, smoke chasing them as they ran. The cold night air hit like ice, but it was clean, pure, and filled with shadows. Bryn's men were already circling. One grabbed for Annabeth, but she twisted free. Elias brought the butt of his rifle down on the man's collarbone hard. Another lunged at Clara. She ducked, rolled. Elias caught the third with a shove that sent him sprawling into the snow. "Run," he shouted. "Go." Annabeth took the lead, dragging the others toward the tree line, toward the cave. Elias stayed. He turned back toward the cabin, now fully engulfed. Firelight painted the snow gold and orange. Bryn stood near the edge, hands in his coat pockets, eyes locked on Elias. "You think this makes you a hero?" Bryn called. "No," Elias said, "just a father." Bryn drew his pistol. Elias raised his rifle. Neither fired. Then someone screamed behind the trees. "Annabeth!" Elias turned, ran. He reached them just in time to see one of Bryn's men dragging Annabeth by the arm, Clara clinging to her leg, Miriam still on the ground crying. The man raised his hand. Elias fired. He didn't miss. The man dropped like stone. Annabeth shoved Clara behind her. Blood stained the snow, bright and blooming. "Are you okay?" Elias panted. Annabeth nodded. He didn't touch her. Elias scooped Miriam up. "To the cave, go." They ran, fast, blind. Elias felt every heartbeat like a drum in his ears. They reached the cave just as more gunshots cracked behind them. Elias dropped to his knees, slammed the wooden barrier across the entrance, and braced it with his back. He was breathing too hard, seeing too much. Annabeth sat down beside him, still holding the carving knife. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For being afraid." He looked at her. "That's how you know you're still alive." Outside, the fire roared, the forest glowed. Elias didn't know what would come next, but he knew what they'd already survived. He had chosen them once. He would choose them again. And whatever Bryn had left in him, he'd have to burn through Elias to use it. Morning didn't come gently. It broke through the trees with a sky like bruised copper and ash. Smoke still drifted from what was left of the cabin, a skeleton now, scorched black and eaten to its bones. The chimney stood crooked like a gravestone. The woods were quiet, too quiet for safety. Elias watched from the mouth of the cave, his back aching, his legs numb from a night spent upright against the barricade. He hadn't slept. Couldn't. Not with the smell of fire still clinging to the inside of his nostrils. Not with the echo of gunshots ringing in his ears. Not with the memory of Annabeth's knife clenched so tight her knuckles had gone bloodless. The girls stirred beside him one by one. Miriam whimpered first, curling tighter into her blanket. Clara woke second, rubbing her eyes and then gripping Elias' coat as if to make sure he was still real. Annabeth didn't sleep at all. She'd kept watch across from him, blinking slow but steady, every muscle in her face pulled taut with exhaustion and defiance. She didn't speak until the sun cleared the trees. "They'll come back," she said. Elias didn't lie. "Yes." "Then we have to be ready." "They won't be the first ones who have tried to take what didn't belong to them," he said, "but they'll be the last." He meant it. Something had changed in him that night, not snapped, not broken, but hardened. He'd gone from a man looking for peace to one willing to fight for it, not just for himself, but for the 3 children who had become his family without ever asking to. He'd made a choice. He'd made it in front of a judge and a town, in front of fire and gunpowder, and he'd make it again, as many times as he needed to. "We can't hide here forever," Annabeth said. "No," Elias agreed, "but we can hold long enough for the next move." She tilted her head. "Which is?" "Turning this on them." She frowned. "How?" Elias stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his joints. "Bryn thinks he still has the law on his side, but he made a mistake last night. He crossed a line. That fire, what he did to the cabin, that was no raid. That was attempted murder. He burned down a home with children inside. That's something people won't ignore." "People ignored the auction," Annabeth muttered. "Not anymore." Elias walked into the light. The forest floor crunched underfoot, frozen and brittle. Birds were starting to return, but cautiously, chirping from far-away trees. The world always came back to life eventually, even after fire, even after war. Back at the remains of the cabin, nothing moved. The embers had died sometime before dawn. Elias stepped over fallen beams, ash puffing up around his boots, and paused in front of the hearth, cracked, still warm, the last piece standing from a life he'd tried to build. He crouched down and reached beneath the stones, finding what he'd buried a long time ago, a small iron lockbox wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were the last documents that tied him to his past, marriage papers, his son's birth certificate, land deeds signed in his name. He didn't need them anymore. But what was tucked between those pages was what mattered now. Letters, dozens of them, sent and received. Letters between townsfolk, judges, and government offices. Most of them went unread, ignored, stamped, and shelved. But not all. Elias stood again and turned to Annabeth, who'd followed silently. "You said you wanted to do more than survive," he said. She nodded. "Then this is how." They rode for the nearest town, St. Arbor again, though they took a longer route, keeping clear of known paths. On the second night, they camped in an abandoned hay barn. Elias stayed up listening to wind rattle broken shutters while Clara dreamed fitfully. On the third day, they arrived, tired and hungry but alive. This time, Elias didn't head for the courthouse. He headed for the paper. The editor was a woman named Fernley. round spectacles, ink-stained fingers, and a voice like a river rock. Smooth, cold, immovable. "You have 10 minutes, she said when Elias walked in. "I only need 2, he said. 3 children were sold in Cold Hollow, auctioned like cattle. I took them in. Then the man who arranged it tried to kill us, burned down my home, and he's not finished. That bought him the other 7. He laid the documents out across her desk. Legal orders, voided custody claims, a photograph of the cabin taken weeks ago, a charred fragment of the sheriff's failed warrant, letters to the governor no one had answered. "You're serious," Fernley said, no longer pretending to look bored. "I'm telling you what happened. You can either print it or bury it." Fernley narrowed her eyes. "If I print this, you'll have more than Bryn to worry about. You'll have every man who ever got away with the same thing. You'll be dragging a lot of shadows out into daylight. Then let them burn in it." She looked at the girls standing just behind him. Clara with her dirt-streaked cheeks and wide, watching eyes. Miriam gripping a stuffed rabbit and trying not to cry. And Annabeth, chin high, fists clenched, not afraid of her own voice anymore. Fernley nodded. "Come back tomorrow." The article ran 2 days later. It spread faster than fire. The headline wasn't subtle. "Children auctioned in Cold Hollow, judge complicit, sheriff silent. One widower stands alone." By noon, it was being read aloud on porches, reposted on walls, carried by hand to nearby towns. And by dusk, men who'd once looked away were looking in a mirror they didn't like. Bryn read it too. He read it in silence, then tore the page in half and stormed out of the tavern where he'd found it. He rode hard that night, but not toward Elias. Toward the judge who'd signed the original order. By the end of the week, the governor's office had received enough letters to send a marshal. The trial didn't last long. Bryn's influence fell apart the way rot does when scraped clean, fast, foul, and loud. He'd paid off 2 witnesses, threatened 3 more. The sheriff resigned before he could be questioned, and the judge, once cornered, crumbled like old paper, admitting he'd seen the money, ignored the warning signs, and let it all pass for the sake of peace. But peace built on silence was never peace at all. The girls didn't attend every hearing. Elias shielded them where he could, but Annabeth went to the final verdict. She sat straight-backed in the courtroom, dress ironed, hair combed, eyes steady. She didn't flinch when Bryn was sentenced. She didn't smile either. Outside, the town square was quiet. A new chill hung in the air, early spring trying to push winter away. Elias stood with her, hands in his coat pockets. "It's over," she said. "For now," he replied. "You think there'll be others. Men like him always come back, but not him, and not here." She nodded slowly. "I want to stay." "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I want to." They returned to Cold Hollow in April. The cabin was gone, but the land remained. Elias rebuilt slowly, with help. Locals who once turned their eyes now offered hands. Wood was donated, furniture hauled from attics, paint mixed from leftover stores. A new home took shape, not just a shelter but a promise. That fall, a school opened in the church hall. Annabeth taught 3 days a week. Clara learned to read. Miriam grew bold enough to speak in full sentences to strangers. And Elias, he planted an apple tree beside the porch. His wife had always wanted one, said it made a place feel permanent. He carved a name into the fence post. The brand home. Not just a name anymore. A legacy. Because family isn't blood. It's choice, it's sacrifice, it's standing in fire and deciding to stay anyway. And when the wind howled again through the trees that winter, it didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like a promise,